Japan just broke a rule it kept for 76 years. Since the end of World War II, Japan legally could not strike another country. That was the deal. You lost the war, you keep your military purely defensive, end of story. But right now, in 2025, Japan is purchasing cruise missiles capable of hitting targets 620 miles away, deep inside Chinese territory. Combined with 54,000 American troops already positioned around China's coastline and a chain of armed islands stretching from the northern Pacific all the way down to the Philippines, something enormous has been quietly assembled. And Beijing never got a formal announcement. Nobody did. This is not a drill. This is the most strategically significant military encirclement since the Cold War, and it has direct consequences for your wallet, your supply chain, and the global economy. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. This channel breaks down the financial and geopolitical moves that the mainstream misses. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me whether you think China can break out of this, and watch this video till the end, because part 3 is where the real economic consequences land. Let's establish the baseline, because the numbers alone are staggering. China currently operates the world's largest navy by hull count, over 370 warships and submarines, with more than 140 major surface combatants. China's 13 naval shipyards have more combined construction capacity than all 7 U.S. naval shipyards put together. On paper, Beijing looks unstoppable at sea. But here's what the raw numbers don't tell you. Geography is destiny. And China's geography is a strategic nightmare. Look at a map. China's entire coastline, every port, every naval base, every carrier that Xi Jinping is so proud of, sits behind a long curved chain of islands. This is called the First Island Chain. It runs from the Kuril Islands in the north, through the full length of the Japanese archipelago, down through the Ryukyu Islands, past Taiwan, through the Philippines, and all the way to Borneo in the south. It is roughly 3,000 miles of natural geographic barrier. And right now, every critical node on that chain is either a U.S. military base, a U.S. allied military position, or both. This is not an accident. This is 70 years of deliberate American strategic architecture. And Japan is now the most important brick in that wall. The island chain concept was first formally articulated in 1951 by U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. The idea was straightforward and brutal in its logic. You don't need to defeat China in open ocean combat if you never let China reach the open ocean in the first place. Position American aligned forces across the Pacific Island arc, and China's navy is permanently contained to its near seas. During the Cold War, this strategy was largely theoretical. But after China's economy exploded in the 1990s and 2000s, and Beijing started building the most aggressive naval expansion program since Imperial Japan in the 1930s, Washington quietly reactivated the playbook, this time with Japan as the cornerstone. The 1978 U.S.-Japan Defense Guidelines had already tasked Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force with controlling the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. Japan built a serious naval capability around that mission: modern destroyers, advanced submarines, and a surveillance network covering every major choke point leading from China's coast into the Pacific. But in 2022, something shifted fundamentally. Japan released its new national security strategy, the most dramatic military policy reversal in the country's post-war history. For the first time since 1945, Japan officially named China as its biggest strategic challenge. And it committed to doubling its defense budget from roughly 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP over 5 years. That's not a budget adjustment. That is a complete national security transformation. Fast forward to right now, and the pace of that transformation is accelerating faster than even the 2022 strategy anticipated. Japan's defense budget for fiscal year 2025 has reached $70 billion, exceeding 2% of GDP 2 full years ahead of the original schedule. Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi confirmed this publicly, describing it as the minimum necessary given what Japan faces. The FY 2026 draft budget is already up 9.4% on top of that. What is that money buying? Let's be specific, because the specifics are what Beijing is watching. Japan is procuring Tomahawk cruise missiles, the same American-made precision strike weapon that the U.S. military has used in every major conflict since the Gulf War, and integrating them onto Japanese destroyers. Japan is mass-producing its upgraded Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles, now with a range of approximately 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles. The first batch is already deploying to Japan's southwestern Kumamoto prefecture, ahead of schedule. Japan is developing hypersonic guided missiles flying beyond Mach 5. And it has secured 4 MQ-9B Sea Guardian long-endurance surveillance drones for persistent maritime awareness across the Ryukyu approaches, the very islands closest to Taiwan and China's coast. Here's the part that should genuinely shock you. Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost point, sitting just 110 kilometers from Taiwan, is now being armed with medium-range surface-to-air missile systems. The U.S. Marines conducted their first ever forward arming and refueling operations there in late 2025. That island was previously barely on anyone's radar. Today, it is a forward military outpost sitting at China's doorstep. And the U.S. side of this equation? The 54,000 American military personnel stationed across Japan, at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, at Naval Station Yokosuka, across dozens of installations, are not just tripwire forces. They are integrated into a joint kill chain that connects American satellites, Japanese radar networks, and Allied strike assets into a single coordinated targeting system. This is not two separate militaries working alongside each other. This is one combined force operating from a geographic arc that China cannot escape without punching through. Here's the number that puts all of this in perspective: $3 trillion. That is the approximate value of Chinese trade that flows annually through waters now monitored, missile-covered, and in a conflict scenario, potentially blockaded by US and Japanese forces. China's economy is export-dependent. Its navy, no matter how large, needs to exit through choke points that are now under the gun of Allied anti-ship missiles, submarines, and surveillance drones operating 24 hours a day. Beijing built the world's largest navy. Washington and Tokyo quietly built the world's most effective cage around it. And in Part 2, we break down exactly how that cage works, choke point by choke point, and why China's own admirals are losing sleep over a problem that no amount of new warships can solve. So, Washington and Tokyo built the world's most effective cage around China's fleet. Now let's talk about what that cage actually looks like. Not theoretically, structurally, choke point by choke point, because this is where the strategy gets almost brutally elegant, and where Beijing's naval expansion starts looking less like strength and more like an expensive trap they walked into themselves. Pull up a map of East Asia. China's coastline opens onto 4 bodies of water: the Bohai Sea, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. Every single one of them is a semi-enclosed sea, meaning China's fleet, regardless of size, cannot reach the open Pacific without threading through one of just a handful of narrow passages. And each of those passages is now sitting under the crosshairs of US or Japanese military assets. Let's go through them one by one, because every American who uses a gas pump, buys consumer goods, or has money in a retirement account needs to understand this geography. The Miyako Strait sits between Japan's Okinawa Island and Miyako Island, a passage roughly 250 kilometers wide. It is the primary route for Chinese naval vessels attempting to move from the East China Sea into the open Pacific. And right now, it is one of the most heavily monitored maritime corridors on Earth. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force tracks everything that passes through here. Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, home to 54,000 US military personnel, sits directly adjacent to this passage. Japanese radar networks, US surveillance aircraft, and Allied submarine patrols maintain continuous awareness of every vessel transiting this strait. And Beijing knows it. In late 2024, China actually conducted exercises simulating a blockade of the Miyako Strait, essentially rehearsing the question, what if we tried to take control of our own exit route? Japanese authorities tracked the operation in real time. 6 Chinese ships, including Coast Guard vessels with 76mm cannons aboard, transited from the Pacific back into the East China Sea while turning off their AIS transponders, the maritime equivalent of going dark. Analysts read it as a direct practice run for a Taiwan contingency. Here is the problem for Beijing. They can rehearse all they want. Japan is now deploying medium-range surface-to-air missiles on Yonaguni Island, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan's coast. U.S. Marines conducted their first-ever forward arming and refueling operations there in 2025. The Miyako Strait, in a real conflict scenario, would not simply be monitored. It would be contested and potentially sealed. Stop and think about this for a second. China has 370 warships, but 370 warships that cannot exit their home seas without passing through a passage under U.S.-Japanese surveillance is not a blue water navy. It is a very large, very expensive coastal defense force. That distinction between a navy that can project power and one that is effectively contained is everything. And the financial consequences of that containment are already running into the trillions of dollars. Now here's where this goes from military strategy into pure economic warfare. And this is where every American watching this needs to pay close attention. Former Chinese President Hu Jintao coined a phrase back in 2003 that Beijing has never stopped obsessing over. He called it the Malacca dilemma. And it describes a vulnerability so severe that China has spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars trying, and largely failing, to solve it. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow passage connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. At its narrowest point, it is less than 2.5 kilometers wide and just 23 meters deep. Roughly 100,000 ships pass through it annually. More critically, on over 80% of China's oil imports and more than 2/3 of its total trade volume flow through this single choke point every year. In the first half of 2025 alone, the strait carried approximately 23.2 million barrels of oil per day, with China accounting for nearly half of those crude flows. The U.S. Navy, alongside Japan and Australia, maintains persistent surveillance and presence throughout this corridor. The U.S. operates from bases in Guam, Diego Garcia, Okinawa, and multiple Philippine installations. Singapore, which sits at the eastern entrance of the strait, maintains close defense cooperation with Washington. In a conflict scenario, the combined naval and air power of the U.S. and its allies could apply severe pressure on this passage, legally, through exclusion zones, or through the kind of strategic leverage that doesn't require firing a single shot. This is what makes the Malacca dilemma so devastating for China. You cannot run the world's second largest economy on an energy supply that your primary adversary can interrupt. And right now, no overland pipeline, not the Myanmar corridor, not the China-Pakistan economic corridor, can carry enough volume to compensate if the maritime route is disrupted. China moves roughly 15 million barrels of oil per day. No pipeline on Earth currently comes close to replacing that seaborne volume. Here's the part that Beijing almost never discusses publicly, because it represents perhaps their most acute vulnerability. Chinese submarines face what one analyst at the Center for International Maritime Security recently described as extremely high detection risks immediately upon leaving port. The U.S. Navy has spent decades building a three-dimensional undersea surveillance network across the first island chain. Seabed acoustic sensors, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, satellites, unmanned underwater vehicles, and sonar-equipped destroyers. This network operates continuously. Plan experts themselves have acknowledged internally that interception risks for Chinese submarines remain high even within China's own near seas. The implication is sobering. China's nuclear deterrent depends partly on submarines being able to quietly leave port and disappear into the open ocean. If those submarines are detectable from the moment they leave harbor, and current evidence suggests they largely are, then the strategic calculation changes fundamentally. This is not just a military problem for Beijing. It is a deterrence problem. And deterrence is the foundation on which all great power stability rests. The U.S. Navy maintains 53 fast attack submarines, all nuclear-powered, a capability China has yet to replicate at scale or quality. Quality-wise, American submarines remain generationally ahead of Chinese counterparts in quieting technology, sensor integration, and crew proficiency, developed over decades of actual blue water operations. Now let's talk money directly, because this is where the geopolitics hits Main Street America. China's entire economic model, the one that turned a developing nation into the world's manufacturing engine in 4 decades, is built on maritime trade access. Approximately $3.5 trillion in trade passes through the Strait of Malacca every single year. China's export-led growth, its ability to supply American retailers from Walmart to Apple's supply chain, its foreign exchange reserves, all of it flows through waters that the US and Japan now have significant leverage over. When businesses or governments factor elevated geopolitical risk into shipping lanes, insurance premiums rise. Freight rates move. Supply chains get repriced. Companies begin quietly restructuring their sourcing away from single-point vulnerabilities. This is already happening. The reshoring trend in American manufacturing, the diversification into Vietnam, India, and Mexico, none of it is purely economic. It is driven in significant part by the strategic calculation that over-reliance on supply chains passing through contested waters is a business risk that balance sheets can no longer ignore. And here's what Wall Street quietly understands that most people don't. The US-Japan encirclement strategy is a form of economic leverage that doesn't require a single shot being fired. The mere existence of this containment architecture, documented, armed, expanding, forces China to divert enormous resources into trying to break out of it rather than deploying that capital productively into its own economy. China's defense budget surpassed Japan's back in 2006. Today it dwarfs it, but every yuan Beijing spends trying to build aircraft carriers capable of punching through the first island chain is a yuan not spent on domestic consumption, social services, or the technological innovation China needs to escape its middle-income trap. The cage doesn't just contain China's navy. Economically, it functions like a slow bleed. In Part 3, we answer the real question: can China actually break out? What happens to oil prices, global markets, and American households if this containment cracks? And what is the single number that determines whether this whole strategy holds or collapses? China has the world's largest navy. It cannot freely exit its own coastline. Its oil supply runs through a strait it doesn't control. Its submarines get detected before they clear the harbor. And now Japan, the country that started World War II in the Pacific specifically to break out of a resource embargo, has just rebuilt its offensive military capability and pointed it directly back at Beijing. If that's not one of the most strategically ironic situations in modern geopolitical history, nothing is. But here's what Part 3 is really about. Because up until now we've been describing a cage. What happens if that cage starts cracking? What happens to oil markets, to your supply chain, to the American economy, if this containment architecture fails, degrades, or gets tested for real? And critically, does China actually have a way out that Washington and Tokyo haven't already accounted for? Let's get into it, and stay until the end. Because the final number in this video is the one that determines everything. Beijing is not sitting passively inside this strategic box. Give credit where it's due. China's military planners are sophisticated, and they have been working this problem seriously for over 2 decades. They have 3 main escape routes, and all 3 have critical flaws. Escape Route 1, raw naval mass. China's bet is that if you build enough ships fast enough, you can overwhelm the containment architecture through sheer numbers. The math looks compelling on the surface. China's 13 shipyards produce warships at a pace that genuinely concerns the Pentagon. About 70% of China's current warships were launched after 2010. The fleet is modern, large, and growing. Beijing reportedly aims for 9 aircraft carriers, a number that would actually outnumber US carriers stationed in the Pacific. But here's the problem with mass as a strategy. The first island chain is not a naval formation you defeat with numbers. It is a geographic barrier backed by land-based missiles, submarines, and air power operating from fixed positions that are extraordinarily difficult to neutralize. Japan's new Type 12 missiles, with a 1,000-kilometer range deployed on Kyushu, can reach Chinese naval vessels before those vessels are anywhere near open water. You cannot sink a missile battery by building more destroyers. The geography is permanent. The missiles keep getting more precise. Escape Route 2, the String of Pearls. This is China's most strategically creative response to the Malacca dilemma. Over the past 2 decades, Beijing has invested heavily in a network of ports, bases, and infrastructure across the Indian Ocean, Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. The theory is that by building alternative logistics nodes around the chokepoints, China reduces its single-point vulnerability at Malacca. The problem is execution. Pipelines and overland corridors can carry meaningful volumes, but not remotely close to the 15 million barrels of oil per day that China currently depends on arriving by sea. The China-Myanmar pipeline moves roughly 440,000 barrels per day at full capacity, less than 3% of what China needs. The math simply doesn't work. You cannot build enough pipelines fast enough to replace a maritime artery of that scale. And every port China builds in the Indian Ocean is now being monitored, mapped, and strategically countered by US, Indian, and Australian naval assets operating across exactly those waters. Escape Route 3, Taiwan. This is the one that keeps US military planners awake at night. And it deserves serious analysis rather than emotional reaction. If China gains control of Taiwan by force or coercion, the entire first island chain calculus changes dramatically. Taiwan sits at the midpoint of the chain. It effectively divides Northeast and Southeast Asia into 2 separate operational theaters. Chinese military analysts themselves have described Taiwan's position as the key that unlocks the cage. A Chinese-controlled Taiwan equipped with sensors, missiles, and submarines positioned at that midpoint would give Beijing genuine power projection capability into the open Pacific. It would give China's Navy a forward operating position that currently does not exist. This is precisely why Taiwan is not just a political or humanitarian issue for Washington. It is the structural linchpin of the entire containment architecture. And it is why the 2025 National Security Strategy explicitly named Taiwan's strategic location as dividing Northeast and Southeast Asia into 2 distinct theaters that must be managed separately. U.S. Admiral Samuel Papero, commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, stated publicly earlier in 2025 that Chinese military drills around Taiwan are not exercises. His exact framing, they are rehearsals. That distinction is deliberate and precise. Exercises test capabilities. Rehearsals prepare for execution. Now let's be direct about the financial consequences, because this channel exists to connect geopolitics to your economic reality. Scenario 1. Sustained escalation short of conflict. Even without a shot fired, heightened military tension in the Taiwan Strait or around the Miyako Strait causes immediate and measurable economic damage. Shipping insurance premiums spike. Freight rates rise. Companies accelerate supply chain diversification away from China-dependent routes. During periods of elevated Taiwan Strait tension in 2024 and 2025, container freight rates showed significant volatility, a preview of what sustained pressure looks like. For American consumers, this translates directly to price pressure on electronics, clothing, and manufactured goods that still flow heavily through Asia-Pacific supply chains. Scenario 2. A naval incident or limited blockade. This is where the numbers get genuinely alarming. Over 40% of global seaborne trade transits the waters of the first island chain region. A blockade, even a partial temporary one, of the Taiwan Strait or the Malacca Chokepoint would trigger an energy price shock of historic proportions. China absorbs roughly 48% of crude oil flowing through Malacca. If that flow is disrupted for even 30 days, you are looking at oil price movements that dwarf anything seen since the 1973 Arab oil embargo. And in today's interconnected financial system, an oil shock of that magnitude does not stay in Asia. It hits American gas prices, U.S. corporate earnings, and Federal Reserve policy within weeks. Scenario 3. The containment holds. This is the base case that Washington and Tokyo are explicitly engineering for. And here the financial signal is actually quietly bullish for specific American economic interests. Defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, are direct beneficiaries of this strategic architecture, not just through U.S. procurement, but through the allied arms sales that are multiplying rapidly. Japan's $70 billion defense budget, its Tomahawk purchases, its Patriot and AMRAAM co-production deals with the United States, all of that is American industrial revenue. Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi accelerated defense spending 2 years ahead of schedule. That acceleration is money flowing into American and Japanese defense industrial bases simultaneously. The U.S.-Japan Patriot Missile Co-Production Agreement alone is designed to reduce unit costs while filling stockpiles in both militaries. That is the kind of industrial cooperation that strengthens both economies and deepens the alliance in ways that are genuinely hard to reverse. Earlier, I promised you the number that determines whether this whole architecture holds or collapses. The number is 2027. Xi Jinping has explicitly told the People's Liberation Army to be ready for a Taiwan contingency by 2027. The U.S. Navy's own strategic guidance, Project 33, was built around the same deadline. Japan accelerated its entire 5-year defense plan to hit 2% of GDP 2 years early, directly in response to that 2027 timeline. Every missile deployment, every base construction, every submarine patrol route being optimized right now, all of it is calibrated around a 27-month window that begins closing fast. What happens in and around 2027, whether deterrence holds, whether the containment architecture proves credible, whether Beijing decides the cost of breaking out is too high, will shape the global economic order for the next half-century. The supply chains your company depends on, the energy prices that determine inflation, the defense spending that moves equity markets, the currency dynamics between the dollar and the renminbi. All of it flows from what happens in those straits on those islands around that 110-kilometer gap between Yonaguni and Taiwan's coast. This is not a distant geopolitical abstraction. This is the most consequential economic variable on the planet right now. And the fact that most people are watching it unfold without understanding the structural architecture underneath it, that's exactly why this content exists. Let's bring this home cleanly. The United States and Japan have built a containment architecture around China's naval fleet that is the most sophisticated geographic, technological, and financial encirclement since the Cold War. It runs from the Kuril Islands through the full length of Japan, past an armed Yonaguni Island, through Taiwan's strategic midpoint, down through the Philippines, and wraps around the Malacca Strait with surveillance assets, submarine networks, and allied partnerships that took 70 years to assemble. China built the world's largest navy. But size does not equal freedom of movement. And freedom of movement, the ability to project power into the open Pacific, to protect its energy supply lines, to break the strategic chokehold, is exactly what Beijing does not currently have. The cage is real. Whether it holds is the defining question of this decade. And the answer will determine your energy costs, your investment returns, your supply chain, and the economic environment your children inherit. If this video gave you a perspective you haven't seen anywhere else, subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Every single week, this channel breaks down the financial and geopolitical moves that actually move markets and shape economies. Without the noise, without the political spin, just the analysis. Drop a comment below. Can China break out of this containment? Or is the cage permanent? Let's talk about it. And share this video with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in the Pacific, because this story is moving faster than most people realize.